Well, one issue that's been highlighted as of late, not only through a few years ago we had the Arizona litigation come up, and then DOMA a few years ago, and then not more than a week ago we had the issue in Ferguson County. The issue of civil rights and equality is now percolating back to the surface at a pretty consistent rate. Assuming you are elected, what ideas do you have to try and minimize the strife and the division that inevitably occurs when ostensible civil rights violations or inequalities are made prevalent?
Right. So the way I look at that is, and as someone who's studied our history, our nation's history for many years, taught that our nation's history in our schools, civil rights is something that's very important to me as well. So my analysis of the history and looking at it through the lens, taking the historical lens and applying it to the issues of today, Ferguson, for example, being the most immediate, I see there and this is a theme I think that runs through what you're talking about, and that is a kind of us and them mentality, an us and them kind of a dichotomy. And I've never really looked at American society as an us and them. I see it as a very pluralistic lens of that we're all Americans. So one of the things that I teach my students, is like I start off with this idea of what does it mean to be an American? What is in America? And it's kind of a question that many of my students have never been asked before, and it's a fun way to start a social studies class. And I'll point out, unlike some countries where you can define nationalism based upon race, nationalism based upon language, a shared language, nationalism based upon a shared religion, we don't have a language, etc. We don't have those things in America. American, and we can go all the way back to the days of Alec de Tocqueville, and his observations of the American system back in the 1800s. It's not defined by any of those notions. It's an idea, right? The idea of Americanism and what that means. And so, and through American history, we've had different waves, so to speak, of immigrant groups coming to our country and contributing to the fabric of American society. And so, when I see civil strife, and rights being violated and things like that, one of the things that I talk about with my students is to understand that America was built upon this notion of having separate identities, different types of people coming to our country, contributing to the American way of life, if you will, and being respected for those contributions. So how would I mitigate civil rights strife and whatnot in our own community? I think that the clearest way to do that is by having an open dialogue. As I mentioned before, when you have an us and them mentality, that I think happens through ignorance. When you don't talk to people who are different from you, when all you do is surround yourself by people who think like you, look like you, et cetera, I think what happens is that you lose perspective, that this country is a very multicultural nation and is growing increasingly. And I think it's very important that we have an open dialogue and put ourselves in situations where we can have that conversation. It's one of the reasons why I love being a school teacher in Las Vegas. Certainly as the teacher of the year and other things, I mean, if I wanted to go and get a job somewhere else in a state that maybe pays teachers more, that maybe respects teachers more, and this, that, and the other, I could have done that. But the fact of the matter is I like the multicultural aspect of this vibrant community. And it is a very multicultural community. I see it every day when I'm out knocking on doors. And I enjoy that. And I want to raise my children in a neighborhood and in a place that is racially diverse. I'm not sure if I answered your question as much as giving you my personal philosophy, but that's where I stand.
And some of these questions are intentionally open-ended just to see where people end up going with them.
Good.
Working within, before we were on camera, we were talking about the influence of the teachers union in general, and I'm sure many times there are people even within the union itself that have different ideas, causing a great deal of dysfunction. What lessons can you take from your interactions with a teachers union or groups of that to go up to Carson, which
Yeah.
sometimes can be dysfunctional in nature as well.
Yeah, so absolutely. Part of being a teacher is really kind of putting yourself into the middle of polemics, in the middle of a situation where you have different stakeholders and interest groups kind of pulling in different directions. We kind of alluded to that a little bit earlier today. So you have the teachers who kind of see things through their lens. You have students who kind of have their point of view and are tugging in a different way. Then you have parents who are maybe pulling in a different way. Then you have administrators who are enforcing the laws and this, that, and the other pulling, in a different direction. And then maybe you have community stakeholders. And so teachers oftentimes find themselves kind of in the middle of this crossfire. So it's not an unfamiliar place to be. In regard to the teachers union, like you mentioned, I believe in the teachers union, and I am a member of the Clark County Education Association, the Nevada Education Association, and of course the National Education Association. However, that doesn't mean that I don't have ideas of my own, and certainly I do. I believe in unionism, and I'll tell you why. It really doesn't take much further than to look at our own government and the way that our founding fathers set up our government. So our government is based upon one very important principle, and that's the separation of powers. That's why we have a federal branch, we have a executive branch, we have a legislature, we have a Supreme Court. Each one of those branches has its own autonomy and has powers and checks and balances over the other branches. We could play a thought experiment and say, well, what do you suppose would happen then if there were no legislature and no Supreme Court? Well, that would be then a dictatorship, right? You'd have an executive with a whole lot of power to do whatever they want. So I kind of apply that to what I see in education. If you had just an administration, a central office with unchecked power, they would be able to essentially do whatever they wanted to the teachers. Hey, we have a budget crisis. Hey, let's just take the teachers and knock their salary down to minimum wage. The teachers union protects teachers from those kinds of usurpations of power, and I think that it needs to be there. The workers need to be protected. It's not just in education, it's in any profession. So I think that those protections should be there, and I support that.
What then is the appropriate check when you have a union or a group that is able to usurp the power of another then? What happens when one leg of the triangle becomes too strong?
I think can you give me a specific example? I think that might be easier.
Without putting it into, and we had discussed this briefly earlier, but we'll just talk about the teachers union.
Okay.
Many people are critical of the teachers union in general, saying they're too protectionist, they're keeping too many bad teachers in where they shouldn't be.
Sure.
They're not letting, I don't want to say the administration, but they're not letting the natural selection process take its course, because they're saying, no, this person's protected and you need to jump through all of these hoops before you can get rid of Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so
Or
let me address
tenure, as it were.
And that right now is the real popular case after the decision that was handed down in California, essentially eradicating teacher tenure. So here's the way I look at that. And that is that at the end of the day, think about it this way. At the end of the day, the teacher who is in question received that tenure because of a principal's authorization. So what that means is, and right now, in order to receive tenure, you have to be in the classroom for 3 years, and I think that the legislature rightfully pushed that number back from 1 year to 2 years. Honestly, I'd like to see it at 5. And I'll tell you, because I don't think that you can really know whether or not a teacher candidate is the right type of person in terms of affecting change, in terms of student growth and whatnot in 3 years. It's just not enough. Especially being in the classroom for as long as I have, I know that at year 3, I was still just learning. And I don't know that I would have been suitable, put it that way, at that young, tender age to say, okay, well, this is going to be a good teacher and this one is not. So while I believe in teacher tenure, and I do, and I just want to remind you that tenure is not a job guarantee for life. What tenure is essentially a due process for teachers. this is why I believe in teacher tenure, particularly in this school district at this point in time. The reason is because you have so many things that are coming down the pipeline, so many things being done to teachers from above, that you combine that with the capricious nature of some administrators. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that all administrators are bad, because I'm not. I've worked with some amazing administrators, but there are some bad ones out there. Think about it this way. In 2006 and before the Great Recession hit, I mean, we were in the same situation as we are now in terms of unprecedented growth, right? And I remember this because this is about the time I came into the profession in 2001, but nonetheless. And I remember that there were people who had been teachers for 2 years who were making the jumps into administration. And that was acceptable because they were so short of administrators. So many administrators that we have currently in the profession had only 2 years of teaching experience. I don't think that an administrator with 2 years of teaching experience can truly be an effective leader of teachers when they weren't really a teacher themselves. And I think that plays a part of it. So when you have all of these changes, when I talk about changes, I'm talking about new changes to the teacher evaluation, implementation of the Common Core, merit-based, high-stakes testing attached to merit-based promotions, that I think that, especially in this time of change, that teachers need to be protected from arbitrary and random firings. I have seen things in the school district that would make me believe that unfortunately sometimes teachers can be kind of singled out, and they need to be protected.
Can I have your point of view of what is a Common Core? What's that about, in short?
I'm glad you asked me, because Common Core is probably one of the things that is most
controversial,
commonly cited, but least understood by a lot of people, spectators. So what the Common Core basically is a agreed upon national set of standards right now for the English language arts and for mathematics. They're working on what they call the next generation science standards. We don't currently have those. The idea was this: before Obama's education initiative, Race to the Top, we had what's called No Child Left Behind. That was the initiative of George Bush. It was a bipartisan effort. It was put into place, I believe, in 2002, something around there.
Yeah, the worst thing that ever happened.
Well, the idea is that you were going to have, and the mandate was by 2014 to have all students in the country proficient in English and math by 2014. And of course, that was an unfunded mandate. There was no money attached to that. It was just kind of like, go make that happen. So one of the ways in which they were going to do that is by standardized tests, testing the students at the end of the year, and you would show proficiency through those exams. Now, what happened is that there was no uniformity through those exams, meaning that each state was allowed to essentially create their own exams based on their state standards. And so in low-performing states, educational states, like, for example, well, that is one of them, unfortunately, but also like New Mexico, Mississippi, places like that. Oh, by the way, one of the important aspects of the No Child Left Behind was that each school in each state had to show what they called AYP, or annual yearly progress. And if a school in a state failed to show annual yearly progress, then they would have 3 years to correct the situation. After that, then they would start firing teachers or move teachers around, and there was all kinds of other things in place. So what began to happen is that if a state failed to make annual yearly progress, what they would do is make those end of the year exams and assessments easier so that they could pass the test. And some have derisively called that, essentially a race to the bottom. So if I can't pass the test at that benchmark, Mississippi says, I'll just lower it here. So now, next year, I can pass the test. And there was nothing in place, the federal government had nothing in place to prevent states from lowering their standards. So, flash forward to now, what we have is what's known as the Common Core. And the Common Core is a commonly agreed upon set of standards for English language arts and math that say this is going to be the benchmark. Now, states will be able to add or to make their curriculum, their standards even more rigorous, but they may not be less rigorous than the Common Core. And that was the idea. Now, one of the problems with the No Child Left Behind was that there was no way to know. Let's take, for example, a particular block of kids. Let's say students at the 4th grade, students at the 8th grade. There was no way for us to know how Nevada's 4th graders compared to some of the higher achieving states like, say, New Jersey or Massachusetts in the 4th grade. Why? Because each state has their own standards, and would be like comparing apples to oranges. So what the Common Core does is it creates a uniform set of objectives or of standards. But then also what happens is that states have opted into 2 very different testing consortiums. And what those are basically online tests. So now Nevada's kids can accurately be compared to, say, students in a different state. And in order for us to elevate the achievement of all of our states, right, because that's what we want to do, I don't see any better way than what the Common Core proposes. Now, if we look at other states that do really well on what's known as the National Assessment of Education Process, or the NAEP exam, that's sometimes referred to as the, I'm thinking it's PISA, excuse me. The PISA is an international test that's given, I think it's in the 8th grade and 9th, something like that. And what that exam shows us is that America, by no surprise, is slipping, right? Here's something that's interesting to note, though. And a researcher has recently done this, and I'll wrap this up. You get me going on this ed stuff, I keep going forever. But what they've noticed is that when you're looking at individual states, right? When you compare, say, one of the top performing countries on the PISA exam, that's Finland, right? Finland, South Korea, Singapore, Canada, Australia does pretty well. But when you look at those, right, and then you compare it to the United States, you see this huge discrepancy, right? Finland, obviously number 1. The United States is somewhere, 37th in the world, something like that. How do we get, okay. But that's not giving us an accurate picture, right? That's the United States as a whole. Remember, we have a federal republic, so that means we have 50 individual states operating under the federal government. So if you start looking at it by state compared to Finland, then you see a huge discrepancy, right, in terms of educational performance. New Jersey, again, Massachusetts, Connecticut, many of the New England states do really well, and compare up there with Singapore and with Finland. Nevada is right down there with Zimbabwe, right, and New Mexico. I mean, really, we are. Nairobi and places like that. So it's a huge discrepancy within our American educational system. The Common Core is trying to raise the expectations for all students across the country. Does that answer your question about the Common Core? And that's why I support it.
Better.
Yeah.
But what about the?
No Child Left Behind,
But the teachers' union.
it's much promotion. That's
Let
what
me
it
get back
is.
to that one. The teachers' union is protecting the teacher from benefits, but there is no. But all the education is dropping, right? But they're not responsible for it. You see what's wrong with the picture?
I would disagree with that. I don't know that education is dropping as much as.
Well, you just said we're like Zimbabwe.
Okay,
Well,
but
a level.
I'm not so sure that if you're looking at American education historically, are kids in 2014 doing that much worse than, say, kids were doing in 1970? No. As a matter of fact, we have more high school graduates now. We have more kids who are reading at grade level than ever before, right? When we compare ourselves to 1970. So what's changed? The world's changed. The world has changed. The United States, in its height, right, in its zenith of world power, in the post-World War II era, going through the 70s and through the 80s. What got us there? Industrial might. Well, what does that mean? That means that you could graduate right out of high school and go to work in a steel plant or for Ford Motor Company and live a middle-class existence. You didn't need higher education. So since the 1990s and probably a little bit before that with technology, that's the new frontier. And that's one of the things that, why it's so important that we educate our kids, right? to a level that will allow them to compete with the world in terms of technology and to keep up with the technological changes that are going. Finland, of course, is a home of Nokia, right? And those kids are really thinking outside of the box and they're creating products. Now, look, we do have pockets of innovation, no doubt about it. Obviously, Steve Jobs and others are from this country, educated in our systems. But I don't know that America is slipping in terms of where we were in the golden age as much as the rest of the world is catching up. And I think that's what's going on.